Tales, everyone. I hear some people have come all the way from Ontario for this program.
All the way.
Thank you for coming. This year's theme is in the first person. So we do this program, Tea and Tales, every year, and we have a theme. And the presentations are sometimes put together by locals, sometimes they're put together by museum people. This year we really wanted to dig into the archives so that we're presenting stories that were written by Pembertonians. So that the voice in these Tea and Tales this year is the voice of people who lived in Pemberton. We do have some presentations this summer that people will be putting together for us. So we have got Teresa Smith presenting the story of Gunnar and Marjorie Gims. She's putting together the family history because there's a big Gims family reunion this summer. And Eric Anderson out of Squamish is going to come and entertain us again. He'll tell us the story about the Barber family, who were pioneers of Squamish and Pemberton. And this takes us back to the turn of the century. Brenda McLeod will be reading Francis Decker's memoir regarding the 1940 flood. At the end of, this will be the last Tea and Tales, and she's also the chair of the Diking District, so she'll be trying to connect that big flood event to flood control today. So the first three T's, though, will be presented by me, and these are going to be stories out of the archives. So today's story is written by George Walker, and he wrote the memoir in 1990, and he died in 2003 at the age of 89. He first moved to Mount Currie in 1945 to log with Bill Spetch. Spetch is an old family name in the area. Prior to that, he'd been running sawmills at Rethel and Parkhurst. Those places are what we would now today call Whistler, on the far side of Green Lake. Well, Rethel would be, I think, a little closer to Pemberton. And George and many of his brothers were all involved in logging at some point. George grew up during the Depression, and as the eldest, he was aware of his family's struggles, and he went away to start working at a very young age. He lost 3 siblings throughout his lifetime due to accident or illness, and he talks about the impacts of this. And this was a very common experience for people of George's generation. And he grew up in an era that fostered men who weren't afraid of working hard and taking big risks in a variety of industries, like fishing, logging, mining, or maybe all three. And his story is really reflective of an overall era of industry after the Second World War and through the 50s in BC that saw real economic expansion as Crown resources could be accessed by increasing road and rail systems. And that's exactly what happened up here. There was no way of getting the timber out of Pemberton until the railroad had the capacity to haul timber all the way from Pemberton. And he had a great impact on Pemberton, building bridges and roads, creating local jobs, milling lumber for buildings like Pemberton Hotel and the Legion and the BC Hydro houses, and showing the first movies in Pemberton at the community hall. His brother Bob was his partner in the mill for many years. And today, Bob Walker still lives on the farm with his wife, May. And Bob and his brother, Lindsay, are the last of the Walker brothers. George wrote this memoir in 1990, and he died in 2003. He was also a significant donor to the museum collection. If you go next door and see our equipment collection, many, many objects were donated by George. And he used to love poking around the old gold rush sites, and many of the artifacts that we have from that 1860 period were thanks to George Walker going and looking for them. I believe he even used a metal detector at some points. Just a note that this story is 39 pages, so we have edited it for length. But if any of you want to read the full version, just email us. We're happy to share a copy. And just regarding place names, you'll hear place names of Parkhurst, Rethel, and Lost Lake, and Rainbow Lodge. Those are all references to the Whistler area. And then you'll also hear references to Chilsampton and Creekside, and that's today known as Mount Currie. All right, you ready? Okay, so George begins. I was born at Swift Current, Saskatchewan on April 29th, 1913. My mom always told me that I was named after my great-grandfather, who was of Irish descent. Mother was of English descent. My sister Irene was about 18 months older than myself. Dad was working as a freight handler for the Canadian Pacific Railway, as well as doing carpentry work. He'd applied for a homestead near Tompkins, Saskatchewan, so we moved there when the deal went through. Bert and Grace were born while we lived at Tompkins. Irene died of influenza, as so many did at that time, so this was disheartening for the folks. They had poor luck farming as there was such a drought, so they decided to give it up after a few seasons. We packed up and left for Edmonton, as I suppose Dad heard there were jobs there. That was the way of the times. Edmonton had no shortage of empty houses, and Dad found enough work to keep us fed. It seemed every time we moved, though, Mom had to fumigate the house before we moved in. In those days, there were a lot of bed bugs, and they could survive in an empty house for years. Several of the folks' neighbors who had also left Tompkins heard of homesteads near Vanderhoof, BC. So the folks packed up again when summer came, and we went with our neighbors on the train to Vanderhoof. We had to walk a long way. The folks planted potatoes, but they wouldn't even sprout, so it was useless to stay there. One might wonder why anyone would go there in the first place. Well, the land was misrepresented, falsely advertised to the people. They were shown pictures of gardens and fruit trees in bloom, obviously not from Vanderhoof. Back to Edmonton we went, and then continued to move around. While we were living in Edmonton, Dorothy and Bruce were born to make a family of 5 children. In 1924, Dad decided to move us to Vancouver, promising Mom he would settle down there. We took the train, sitting up all the way. That must have been some trip for the folks. When we got to Vancouver, we got a room at the Ivanhoe Hotel until we could get a house. Dad had to work for enough money to pay the hotel bill before we could leave. As for doing the naughty things youngsters usually do, I guess I have some guilt. The buses in Vancouver fascinated us boys, so we figured out a way to get a free ride. We picked up used transfers and made our own punch mark, got on the bus and rode to the end of the line. The bus was a 30-passenger touring bus. When we got off at the end of our trip, the driver said, "How did you like the free ride?" After that, we were scared to do it again for the ride home. We were stranded quite away from our homes, but one of the boys came up with an idea. He phoned to a store nearby and gave them a phony grocery order to be delivered to the area where we lived. When the grocer brought the order to his delivery truck, we helped him load up and asked, could we get a ride with him? He gave us our ride, but I felt guilty for pulling that trick on him. 1929, times were tough. Tom Woods and I walked to Mission and made a few bucks picking raspberries for 15 cents a case. We rode a freight to the Okanagan and picked fruit. The early fruit was finished, so we went back to Vancouver. Later, Stan Chappell and I went to Kelowna to pick apples. We rigged up his Model T like a covered wagon using a frame of bent vine maple saplings and a canvas cover. It took us 4 days just to get to Kamloops, sleeping in the back of the Model T as the road was being built or improved. We made a few dollars and went back to Vancouver. And he just makes a note here that during that time, many roads and bridges were built and repaired as relief projects, jobs that were created to keep the unemployed busy and give them some money. So all over the province, crews were busy doing road work, much of it with shovels and wheelbarrows. Late summer of 1930, I decided to ride the freight trains to Ontario where my grandparents lived. There were supposed to be more jobs there, at least that's what I was told. The first city where I got off the train was Calgary. Downtown, we found a mush kitchen where the hungry could eat for free. There was only oatmeal and rich milk, but it sure was good and was available 3 times a day. When I was ready to leave Calgary, I had to circle around to the east side of the city to catch the freight. The trains watered up before coming into the city, so we got off then, before the railway police put us off. We'd get back on at the other side of the city. The train would be going slow, and we'd grab a ladder and climb on. There were several other guys waiting to hop on the eastbound freight out of Regina, among them an elderly fellow carrying a suitcase. We got up on a boxcar and the train was moving at a good clip, but I didn't see the older fellow. I wondered what had happened to him. So I started walking along the boxcars looking for him. There he was, hanging onto a blind ladder, one that doesn't go all the way to the top of the boxcar. He handed me his suitcase with both hands free, and my help, he made it up the ladder behind him. It was hard for me to get back on a freight to the west. There were so many guards. The first time I tried, a guard spotted me and told me to get going across the prairie before I got a bullet in my back. Finally, I did get on a train and got back to Calgary. And then, just to give you some context then, he did get a job for a few months harvesting at Three Hills, Alberta, and got a paycheck of $50. And then he decided to go back to Vancouver. The weather was getting quite cold when I caught the freight west for Vancouver. There were no empty box cars, so the bums were riding on flat cars and trying to get some sort of shelter. The train stopped for water at every divisional point. By now we were riding closer to the engine to get what heat there was. The fireman was a real meanie. When he filled the water tank, he'd deliberately slop water on us if he could, and it turned to ice immediately. It was so cold through the mountains I thought I'd freeze to death. I arrived in Vancouver at 2 a.m., black as coal from the train soot. So I got a 50-cent sleeping room for the night and had a bath. Next day I walked home. Mom was so happy to see me after being away for 5 months. She tried to refuse the $50 I'd been carrying in my boot, even though she surely needed it. She knew how hard I'd worked for the money. In reminiscing, I look back on that trip east, riding the rails, as one of my life's greatest experiences. There were too many happenings to relate them all. It was illegal to ride on the trains, but even though men were discouraged from it, the practice continued. Few had money for a ticket. Who could afford a ticket when he was desperate for a job? So many men, unemployed and idle, traveled as railroad bums, as we were called, looking for work. After this, I've taken this part out because it's not Pemberton related, but it is a fascinating bit about his time then at Deep Cove at Roche Point, and he spends some time fishing. And there's lots of adventures there down trying to sell fish down in Vancouver. And then he also lived at Bedwell Bay at the north arm of Burrard. Mom and Dad wanted to get out of the city. Mom thought her children would be healthier in the country. Dad chose 10 acres at Mission, BC, so he and I went there to build a house. We used his car, which had been hidden most of the time, for transportation. See, no one on relief was supposed to own a car. The government gave us vouchers to buy lumber, nails, and tools, and in 2 weeks we had a house built enough to live in and finish later. By this period of time, the folks' family had increased. Bob, Victor, Lindsay, and Ted had been born to make a family of 9 children. Ted was only a baby then, and I was 20 years old. Of course, I'd been away from home most of the past few years, so when I did go home to visit, there would often be a new baby. We all moved out to the farm in several trips in the old Star. The government gave us a cow and 12 chickens. Mom could have a garden, and the whole family helped in one way or another. We cleared the land and dug a well. Things were looking better. So he, at this time he's doing all kinds of different jobs. But while he's working at a mill in 1939, he meets Bob Green, a sawyer. And he's older than George and more experienced. So he told me, Bob Green told George, that B.C. Keeley was looking for someone to set up a mill for him at Lost Lake, 40 miles north of Squamish, where he had a timber sale. Keeley was a lumber broker and owned several sawmills. He hired me with the option of hiring my own crew. My brother Bruce, Tom Lackey, and I took off for Green Lake, where the mill had been shipped by railroad. My wages were quoted as being 65 cents an hour. Tom and Bruce would get 40 cents. To get to Green Lake, we took the Lady Alexander passenger boat from Vancouver to Squamish and then boarded the Pacific Great Eastern Railway, an all-day trip. When we got to our destination, we rented an old truck owned by Bullock Brothers Logging and hauled the mill to Lost Lake. Near the mill site, we reassembled 2 of the partially collapsed buildings in an abandoned mining camp, our cookhouse and bunkhouse. Then we started putting the mill together. More help came, and within a month we started to produce ties, railway ties. Bob Green came to saw in the mill. When payday came, my check was not what I'd been promised. Instead of 65 cents, they only gave me 40 cents an hour. We went to Vancouver to cash the checks Keeley sent us, and there were no funds to make our checks good. After going to see BC Keeley in person, the checks were made good. I didn't argue about the wage discrepancy. In those days, I just took my medicine. I'd not been to see my family for a while, so I decided to stay with them until after Christmas. Mom and Dad were always glad to have some of us come home. After this, in 1940, he spends 2 years at Port Alice pulp mill, and then he returns to Mission. Early in the spring of 1942, Chuck and I thought we might get hired at the West Coast shipyards on Falls Creek. When we got there, we saw about 500 other guys with the same idea. We knew a fellow named Harry Pack who worked there, so I called him from a payphone. He told me he would give our names to the guards, and when they called out our names, we would be let inside the gate. Once inside, we were employed as rust scrapers. Soon I got on as a paint sprayer's helper until there was an opening for a full-time sprayer. Chuck went on to other jobs in the shipyards. The pay was $1.09 an hour, with lots of overtime. It was all shift work. I mostly worked the graveyard shift as I preferred it. It wasn't a bad place to work, except for the paint fumes. After I left the shipyards, I got married and spent most of my savings on furniture. As I had a yearning to get back into sawmilling, I got another job at Green Lake, up in Whistler. We moved to Parkhurst on Green Lake, where I had the watchman's job for the winter at Smith and Keeley's mill. They gave us a shack to live in and supplied grub for the winter. Back in those days, the snowfalls were tremendous, 3 or 4 feet overnight. Bob and Helen Green were also living at Parkhurst, and we got together often. We made a ski run, packed the snow, and skied. Myrtle Phillips lent me her skis, long wooden ones. I had a lot of fun, till one day I fell and twisted my leg, which put me out of commission for a month. Helen played the banjo, Bob played the fiddle, and I played the guitar, so we had a little band. We played for dances at the Rainbow Lodge almost every Saturday night. Bob Green and I decided to become partners and get a mill going. BC Keeley supplied a mill for us with our promise to pay him back at 25 cents per 1,000 feet on the lumber we cut. The timber we applied for and got was at Rethel, mile 45, on the Pacific Great Eastern Railway. As we began to set up the mill in the early spring of 1944, there was still 3 feet of snow. We had to either wheel the mill pieces into the site on the railway tracks or pack them on our backs. Bob had a lame leg, so I did most of the packing. I made a cart with wooden wheels, just round pieces of log with a groove. The cart fit on the rails and we used it a lot, though the section crew frowned on it being used on the tracks. Things went well. Bob sawed and I handled the ties and lumber. We built a few cabins to live in and moved our families from Green Lake to Rethel. Early that spring, my daughter Sherry was born. In late summer, while we were shut down for fire season, I went to Vancouver to get my finances straightened out. I went back to camp, packed up my family, and went back up to the Parkhurst mill for the fall, because it was easy to get work there until close-up. Again, I stayed on as watchman over that winter of 44 and 45. I'd managed to pay the summer's grocery bill at Mackenzie's in Squamish. They accepted what payments I was able to make on the bill, and I was glad, as it kept my credit good. Groceries were ordered by mail or phone and then shipped on the train. In the early spring of 1945, BC Keeley sent word to me of a mill and timber for sale at Chilsampton, which is now Mount Currie. The asking price was $1,000. Keeley would put up the money, and I'd pay him back at 25 cents a thousand. I went for the mill, and for the first time met Bill Spetch, the owner. The whole deal didn't appeal to me. So far from the railway. I had no transportation. Everything would be hauled by horse and wagon. The logging would be done with horses. There wasn't even a motor for the mill. Bill really tried to talk me into the deal, but I went back to Parkhurst uncertain. In 2 weeks, I decided, what the heck? I may as well go through with it. Keeley said I could take the 120 horsepower Chrysler power unit from Rethel. I got permission from the local section foreman, and his crew hauled the motor on a speeder to Chilsampton. I moved my family lock, stock, and barrel to the Spetch place at Owl Creek, and we lived in one of Bill's cabins. Bill's horse and wagon hauled the motor from the railway tracks up to the mill site just below Mosquito Lake, a distance of 2.5 miles. Today that motor powers the planer and still runs in top form. Everything seemed a struggle. I either had to walk or borrow a horse. Usually I walked the railway tracks. I'd run the distance between 2 telegraph poles, then walk the next to break the monotony and speed up the trip. When I finally got the mill going, my orders were for BC Electric's 6x8 ties. They paid $25 per 1,000 loaded on a rail car. Archie Wallace and Adam James rode their horses to work at the mill. Bill did my logging with his team of horses at $10 a 1,000. Adam and Archie got 80 cents an hour. Jack Matthews hauled the ties to the railway on his flat deck truck, and Keeley met the payroll. The first month I cleared $300. Things were really rolling. I paid off my debts and built a better cabin to live in. It was usually dark when I went to work, and when I got through, there was maintenance to do and the saw to sharpen. Also, the slab pile was usually burning, and I had to wait until the fire died down. I hated the trip home in the dark as there were cougars around. In fact, we found cougar tracks circling the mill. I used to carry a can with a candle in it to help me find my way. Bill Spetch decided he would like to be partners with me, and we made a deal to work together and split the profits. The timber we were on was nearly finished by fall, so we put 10% down and bought a timber sale. The new sale was at Birkin, so we had to build a camp. Jack Matthews moved the mill on his flatbed truck over what was little more than a wagon road. We leased land from Gunnar Gim's father to put the camp on. Over the winter of 1945 until the summer of 47, Bill and I worked together. Bill did the logging, I ran the mill, and we did all right. Bill tired of logging though, and he wanted to sell his interest so he could go into the store business. I paid Bill what he asked for, and he went on to buy the grocery store in Chilsampton. Bill knew I was making money and wanted to sell me the Spetch place as he'd moved off it. So in 1947, I paid Bill for the Spetch homestead. I moved everything back to Owl Creek, where I now owned my first piece of land. I set up the sawmill again on my land just above the upper field. Mac Lester took a contract to log for the mill with his team of horses. Also, I could afford to buy a vehicle, and Jack McKay had one for sale. It was a 1947 3/4 ton international pickup, and having a means of transportation was sure a help to me. Also in 1947, my youngest brother Victor, only 19 years of age, was killed in a hunting accident while living at Parkhurst. Needless to say, this was a tragic event for the whole family. 47, I got my first timber sale across the Birkenhead River. To clear the road and the mill setting, I rented a bulldozer from Chris Nygaard in Squamish and operated it myself. It cost me $300 for rental plus the freight to ship it. The big part was having to build a bridge over the river. There weren't any other close areas where logging could be done with horses. Over the winter, we started the bridge. Charlie Mack and Seymour Wallace helped, and we skidded the logs in with Seymour's horses. I planned on a center pier with 2 65-foot spans. We finally finished the bridge by June of 1948 and got the mill moved up to the mill site. Before we could begin running the mill, disaster struck. The river began to rise to a flood stage, and we fought to save the bridge from being washed away. The railway had blasted out a log jam upriver to save the railway from being washed out. Well, the debris came down and washed out my bridge. Needless to say, it was heartbreaking. Right away, we began building another bridge, but not with a center pier this time. The water was still high, but we got the logs across. With a 95-foot span, it was a lot harder to build. I paid $400 for a 200-amp arc welder, as I really had a need for one. To learn how to use it, I read every pamphlet and book I could find and practiced. One day I was trying to do an overhead weld, but it wasn't going so well. All of a sudden, someone took a hold of my hand and turned it around so the arc was going the opposite way. Then the weld went great. When I took off my welder's hood, there stood Paddy with a big grin on his face. Paddy Moore was a little Irishman who was working for me at the time. He says, "You were going at it the wrong way, lad." Patty was an experienced welder and he taught me a lot, so I did become a good welder. In fact, many nights when I came home from the mill, someone was waiting for me to do a bit of welding. I welded everything from farm equipment to drag line equipment, even guns. No one else in the area had an arc welder at that time. The diking district used to get me to take my welder and use the generator to set off electric blasting. They could set off 300 shots at a time. Some of my crew lived at the farm as there was never a shortage of lumber to build a 2-room shack. Over the years, Mom and Dad and all my brothers lived at the farm at one time or another. My son Jerry was born in late 1948 when Sherry was 4 years old. With the excessive amount of lumber from the mill, I felt it to my advantage to buy a planer. I paid $3,000 for one in Vancouver and set it up where it still stands today. For a while, I ran it whenever we brought a load of rough lumber up from the sawmill. But as I had other work to do, my brother Bert learned to run the planer, and in turn, he taught Teddy. The lumber was either shipped out by rail or sold in the area. Many local buildings are constructed from lumber, and they still stand today. The BC Hydro houses, an office, and part of the Pemberton Hotel, to name a few. As I was having trouble getting horse loggers, and these are men that log with teams of horses, in the summer of '51, I decided to buy my own team. But there's a little bit of a story there about how they bought these awesome horses from the PNE, and they brought them up to get them logging, and then Bob Walker, I called to talk to him about this. He says those horses were useless in the woods. They were show horses. They had no idea what they were doing in the woods. The forestry restricted cutting of trees less than 16 inches through at 4.5 feet from the ground. Because of this restriction and little damage to the environment from horse logging, the areas I logged at that time were ready to be logged again in 1989. That same summer, I paid National Machinery for a used D4 Cat. It was used around the mill a lot, but we did make roads and yard-in logs that were too big for the horses. The D4 still sits at the farm today. I plowed snow when it was last used, about 1969. In 1949, the Legion tried unsuccessfully to show movies in the Pemberton Community Hall. I bought their Bell and Howell movie projector for $300 and a 1,500-watt power unit for $700 to run the projector, because at that time BC Hydro wasn't at Pemberton. I had a contract with Sovereign Films for a new show every week. Wednesday night it was shown at the Creekside Reserve Community Hall, Friday night at Pemberton. Everything had to be loaded up and hauled on my flat deck truck if the roads were bad. Otherwise, I used the pickup. The film consisted of a 15-minute newsreel, 15-minute serial, and a 1.5-hour movie. The serial was continued each week, often taking weeks to finish. I charged 25 cents for children and 50 cents for adults, and there was nearly always a crowd. At Christmas, the show was free. By 1951, hydropower came to Pemberton, making it unnecessary to use the power plant. The show was never canceled, and if I wasn't available, Jim Currie showed the films. By 1955, I gave Jim the projector, and he took over completely. The first big change in my logging and sawmill years came through the winter of '53 and '54 when I logged the hydro site at Owl Creek. Instead of sawing the logs into lumber or ties, I shipped them. Pete Shore fell and bucked the logs, and I rented a cat from Fleetwood Logging Company to yard and load. We used a gin pole, and this is an erected pole with guy wires that they use for loading the rail cars near the site. And they were doing 2 carloads a day. We made some money, but not a lot. My sawmill was still running part of the time, and my brother Bob did most of the sawing until I shut the mill down in 1955. Fleetwood was logging down Lillooet Lake in 1950 and had built a camp at Creekside as well as a lake float camp. Howard Anderson was their logging superintendent. It is funny to me, looking back at that time, that some of my crew quit to work for Fleetwood. As it was, Fleetwood was only in the area for a few years before they moved on, and some came back to work for me again for many years. Over the time Fleetwood was logging in the area, Howard Anderson and I became friends. And in 1954, we decided to form a company called A&W Salvage. We got a contract to log what was fell on the BC Hydro right-of-way along the Caribou Road. So he's talking about the Portage Road to Pemberton, or to Bergen and Darcy. We rented a cat to yard the logs and got Fleetwood to haul them to their dump at Creekside until 1955, when Fleetwood made a deal with Howard and I to finish their logging. Howard and I established Cascade Fur Products Company. I guess we thought the name sounded better. This was the biggest financial step I'd ever taken, as every bit of collateral I had went into the company for my share. Now, Cascade Fur Products is, in our history book, the beginning of large-scale logging in the area. Up until this time, it was small operators. So this was the beginning of what became the big logging era in Pemberton. It was later to start here than Squamish or Vancouver. So about this time, I moved my family from the farm to Creekside, and Bob moved his family into my house at the farm. Cascade was logging timber claims along the Caribou Road. We had 2 logging trucks of our own and rented one. As we continued to expand, we put out 14 rail cars of logs a day, about 1.2 million feet of timber a month. Also, we moved into the Mackenzie Basin to log timber sales. Our trucks were off-highway with 12-foot bunks. So all of those roads that go up the Mackenzie Basin, it was the Walker brothers who put those roads in, and this is when that happened. When we got the steel tower, it attracted some attention, being the first one in the area. We set it up at Mackenzie Basin, and our logging could be seen from the Pemberton Valley. There were people then, as there are now, who condemned logging companies for scarring the landscape. By 1958, we were logging across the Lillooet River, as well as the Portage Road and Mackenzie Creek, moving back and forth. The largest crew we employed was 54 men, and we bed and boarded about 20 of them. In 1958, Cascade got its first timber sale at Ryan Creek, so we began building roads in that area and a costly bridge over Ryan Creek. The market was good, and we kept expanding, logging wherever we could get timber, private or crown. In 1958, we logged the most, 16.5 million feet of timber, much of it stockpiled at the loading out yard. Over the winter of 58 and 59, the price of logs dropped. By spring, cedar was selling at a price of $17 a thousand. It cost us $35 a thousand to log it. We couldn't even get a buyer, so we were stuck with 2 million feet. We had an office in Vancouver, as well as one in camp at Creekside. Harry Erickson was with me at the Creekside office as timekeeper, bookkeeper, and first aid attendant. Harry was a true friend, and I appreciated his loyalty. He was with us for about 10 years until we sold. In all the years I employed a crew, there was only one fatal accident, though there were numerous minor injuries over the years. Once a month, safety meetings were held in the camp office. They were meant to help prevent accidents by making the men aware of safety procedures. Unsafe practices were reported at the meetings and later investigated. About 1960, a new system of logging called the quota system was established. The forestry based a company's quota on the amount of timber that company logged on Crown land over a certain period of years. We ended up with a quota of 5 million feet. And we could only survive if we logged others' quotas. So we logged quotas belonging to Bay Forest Products and McMillan Blodell and got what private sales we could. When I've been asked why the farm wasn't logged, I can only say it was close to being logged. In fact, a bit of the northeast corner was catlogged in the early 60s. I had done selective logging to the extent of about 1 million feet for the sawmill in 1947. About that time, Creekside was renamed Mount Currie. The sawmill was set up at Mount Currie Loading Works, so we could saw any timbers we needed. We also sawed the rough siding for the new Pemberton Legion, which was being built in the early 1960s. Jim Collins donated the logs, and a crew of Legion members came to help on weekends. We had a lot of fun and a big celebration after. About this time, Howard Anderson sold his share in the company. In the early 60s, we built a new shop and a cookhouse at the camp, and we purchased a new dozer and a link belt loader. We were logging at Twin Creeks and Joffre Creek, putting those logs into Lillooet Lake. They were then put into booms and towed down the lake. Canadian Forest Products was logging at the bottom of the lake, and we made a deal with them to handle our logs after they were boomed. In 1965, with the company's need for further expansion and extended investment, I decided to sell out. To extend the logging up the Pemberton Valley, recovery from expenses would have taken many years. Another company bought my shares in 1965, and then I continued to work for them until 1967, when Cascade was sold to Pacific Coast Lumber. My brother Ted drowned in Lillooet Lake in the spring of 1966 while he was out in his boat. We searched for quite some time but never found his body. Dad took it badly and died within a month. Mom lived another 2 more years. Vera and I had a house built at the farm in 1968 where we've remained until present, and I hope this will be my last move. My mind was still on setting up the sawmill at the farm, so I began working on that. That same year, in 1970, a construction camp was set up in one of the fields at the farm to house and feed men putting up the hydro's transmission towers. I enjoyed this summer also, as much was going on with 250 men in camp. By June of '71, I had the mill set up and sawed the first logs. It was great to be running at the old mill again. Pete LeBlanc brought me 9 logging truckloads of peeled cedar logs, rejects from the pole yard. They didn't meet pole standards, but they were sure good for lumber, and I cut them on shares, half for Pete. Much of the lumber off those logs was clear, so it was easy to sell my half. Evans Products put in the stud mill at Mount Currie during 1972. That today is the industrial park. As they could only cut 8-foot lengths, they brought their logs to my mill and paid me to cut their bridge stock. I cut the bridge decking and timbers and built their bridges for a few years while Evans logged. They paid me by the hour. I really enjoyed doing this, as I'd missed working with a crew of men since logging. The first bridges were over the Birkenhead River at Lillooet Lake. In between building bridges and continuing to run the mill, sawing and selling lumber, Vera was handling the slabs and the lumber at our mill, and the 2 of us managed fine. During 1975, I had a special order to saw logs for Carlton Cycles outdoor sporting goods store in Vancouver. The logs were sawed to have the bark showing, so the building had a rustic log house look. I cut many special orders for long timbers and off sizes. A lot of logs were brought in to be cut on shares. I was still building a few bridges for different companies, as well as running the mill. But by 1980, we were slowing down a lot, sawing less each year. My health began to deteriorate from 81 until 85, when I had a heart bypass surgery. There was a 2-year recovery period before I ran the sawmill again. I run the mill for a while each summer because it makes me happy to do so. Besides, it's good to keep my lumber stockpile up as I make picnic tables as well as a few other wood crafts. It was 5 years ago, while recovering from the operation, that I started relating my past, not realizing how involved in it I would get. I hope anyone reading this will enjoy the reminiscing as much as I have. George Walker, 1990.